The New York Times' Ezra Klein said recently that, in fact, the emergency is here. John, could you roll that?
The emergency is here. The crisis is now. It's not 6 months away. It's not another Supreme Court ruling from happening. It is happening now. Maybe not to you, not yet, but to others, to real people whose names we know, whose stories we know. The President of the United States is disappearing people to an El Salvadoran prison for terrorists.
Is this overheated or is this accurate?
It's very melodramatic. Like the New York Times is adding this kind of, musical score to it. And I think one
Shadowy
of the,
room.
yeah, exactly. These different camera angles. He's dressed all in black. I think one of the problems here, it's a very much a boy who cried wolf story. And I kept trying to tell liberals this for the past 8 years. They were calling Trump Hitler and fascist and Nazis and saying we were in a constitutional crisis, basically from the minute that Trump emerged as a viable presidential candidate. And through his entire first term, he was actually quite a weak and impotent president. There were so many institutional constraints, I think a lot of illegitimate and quite threatening ones that were uh, consolidated in order to prevent him from carrying out many of the policies that he was elected to carry out. There were openly cheering generals who were subverting his military orders just simply on disagreement on policy grounds. And I ended up thinking that a lot of the dangers came much more from the forces that had the confederation of forces that united to stop Trump in the first term than it did from Trump himself. But all throughout that first term, they were using exactly all of this same language. And then when Trump was running for president, same thing. Basically the primary theme of Kamala Harris's campaign for the last several months was Trump is a fascist, he's Hitler. They impeached him twice based on all sorts of exaggerated claims about what had happened, in my view, at least. And my concern always was that if you always use this overheated rhetoric, if you go immediately to 11 or to, whatever number scale you're using and use the maximalist terms of condemnation, and people just at some point start tuning you out because they don't really see that. People lived through 4 years of Trump. And they didn't feel like they were living under Adolf Hitler. And they shouldn't have been because they weren't. What will happen when Trump does start doing anything or other leaders start doing things that are genuinely gravely threatening to our civil liberties? I thought that a lot of what George Bush and Dick Cheney did under the war on terror were at least as threatening as a lot of what Trump is doing now. In fact, many of the theories of, unitary executive power and vast Article 2 authorities whenever we're in wartime or when it comes to national security were pioneered and implemented by many of the people who are now Trump's leading critics, sort of the David Frums and Bill Kristols and Nicole Wallace's and that whole Bush-Cheney never Trump crowd that has pretended to find all of this so horrifying when in fact they were the ones who were not only cheerleading it, but were the architects of it to begin with. So I think it's worth calming down a little bit. In part, I should add as well, because we're only in the second or third full month of Trump's presidency. He's still very popular among Republicans, and that's the reason you're seeing almost no Republican willingness to limit or push back against anything that he's doing. All of this is going to start to dissipate some with all the economic instability, the concern of the stock market, the tariffs, things not getting better in the way that people were promised. You're going to start to see Trump's popularity erode a little bit further among Republicans. There will be more and more Republicans willing to push back against the most extreme violations. So I don't think it's time for us to all set our hair on fire and to say, oh, the emergency is here, whatever that means. I am extremely concerned about a lot of what is taking place, but I've been extremely concerned from a civil liberties perspective before. And I still believe in the viability of a lot of American institutions. You're seeing Harvard, for example, finally give Trump the finger and now suing him in court. You're seeing some law firms do the same, some media outlets who are still confronting him in a lot of different ways, lawyers and lawsuits. So, I don't think it's time for this kind of melodrama quite yet.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
personally really pissed off because I feel like I have to give credit to the New York Times and Harvard right now. And the number one thing that I don't want to do is give credit to these institutions that have annoyed the crap out of me for a long time. But the Trump administration is forcing me to kind of mend
But
fences a little bit.
what is it is a treacherous path forward because, the moral of the boy who cries wolf is that the wolf eventually comes, and then no one's paying attention. So how do we overcome that sort
or
of
nobody believes the people who are screaming wolf, right? That's the
precisely,
real
yeah,
problem. Yeah.
right. So how do we avoid, being by the wolf? I mean, that's partly the reason we want to have you here today because nobody can credibly accuse Glenn Greenwald of being Trump derangement syndrome, but you clearly are alarmed at this moment. Is that what it's going to take? Is just more people who've been credibly calm, like calling these things out as they happen? Like, is there any hope of like reasonably sounding the alarm without lighting your hair on fire?
So I think it's important to be strategic about how you're trying to convince people and who you're trying to convince.
Mm,
And by that, I mean that I do not have much confidence that, say, people on the right who are Trump supporters are ever going to care about whether, in their, as they would put it, all of the legalities or legal niceties are being observed when it comes to expelling people from our country that they think shouldn't be in our country.
yeah.
That includes not just people who enter the country illegally, but people who are here legally, but who want to protest. And, they have a perception of what these college protests were. And they think anybody who participated in those are probably not good people. Probably our country doesn't benefit from having them there. And you're just never going to convince those people to care enough that um, what's being done to them is not adhering to the law. But I think there are other aspects of what Trump is doing that are extremely closely aligned with those sorts of abuses that you can get even people on the right to care a lot about. And some of those things include abridgments and attacks on civil liberties and free speech that apply not to foreign nationals but to American citizens. So
Right.
I have seen this, one of the things that really did happen is, and this is, just taking a step back a little bit, is I think sometimes we forget that the Democratic Party and liberals writ large really did intend to put Trump into a prison for the rest of his life. That wasn't just something they were threatening to do as a kind of political ploy. They really intended to do that, and they were well on their way to doing that. And Trump's essentially his only chance for avoiding life in prison was to win the election. And he was willing to do almost anything in order to make sure that that happened in a way that, just from a human perspective, is almost understandable. And what happened is you had a lot of people who had a lot of money who weren't really Trump supporters or MAGA adherents who kind of saw the opportunity to come in and to impose their agenda on Trump in exchange for giving him the hundreds of millions of dollars that he needed to be able to compete with and then and ultimately win against the Democratic Party. People like Elon Musk who, swept in kind of at the last minute in order to get a lot of what he wanted. You have people like Miriam Adelson and other people whose top priority is Israel, who swept in and gave a lot of money. And one of the things that those people wanted was they have a huge concern about the fact that public opinion is starting to show that there's a rapidly declining level of support for Israel in the United States for a whole bunch of reasons that we could discuss. And they wanted a full-on government. Yeah, there you see, I believe that's the Pew poll from earlier
Yes.
this month, where you see every single demographic group, with the exception of Republicans above the age of 50. So basically, Fox News watching Republicans, but every single other demographic group, including younger Republicans, Republicans under the age of 49, having a sharp decline in the amount of support they express for Israel, or a sharp increase in the amount of disapproval they express for Israel. And this has been a great concern, not just to Israel, which relies on the United States for being able to basically do what it wants in that region, but the legion of hardcore Israel supporters in the United States that often people assume is primarily American Jews, and that is part of it, but really numerically, more importantly, are a lot of American evangelicals, hardcore kind of just militarists who see Israel as an important ally, a very powerful faction that wants to make sure that everything that can be done to reverse this tide of Israel criticism and the unpopularity of Israel increasing is taking place, even if it means a full scale assault on core civil liberties, not of foreign nationals, but of American citizens. A lot of people don't understand that the TikTok ban that was proposed, 5 years ago in Trump's last year in 2020, based on the argument that it made the United States vulnerable to Chinese influence, lingered in Washington for years because it didn't get enough votes in order to pass. That only
Yeah.
got enough votes to pass after October 7th, when especially Democrats became convinced that the reason there was so much so many young people who were turning against Israel because TikTok was allowing too much pro-Palestinian speech, and that's why they wanted to ban TikTok. The sponsors of those bills say that's why they got the votes. And then there's long been a perception that the greatest threat to Israel is what's happening on college campuses, people's ability to organize, to boycott Israel. That's what brought down the apartheid regime, and the apartheid regime of South Africa in the 1980s was this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that you're seeing now on college campuses. And almost on a weekly basis now, we're seeing new types of censorship being imposed, not to protect American citizens, but to protect this foreign country of Israel. Just yesterday, I'm sure you guys saw, there were these insane guidelines that emanated from the National Institute of Health that said that any researchers, we're talking here about medical researchers, health researchers, people who are investigating treatments and cures for cancer and Alzheimer's, will instantly lose all of their NIH grants and funding unless they certify that they do not participate in a boycott of Israel. They can boycott any other country in the world. They can even boycott the United States. They can boycott American states. They just can't boycott Israel. And I think this is a main priority for a lot of people inside the Trump administration. You're seeing a very overt effort to suppress free speech, the right of free protest, the right of free discourse in the name of this cause. And this is the kind of thing that I think can even make people on the right start to question whether what they were promised, which was a restoration of free speech, academic freedom protected from the questioning of all orthodoxies on college campuses, is being assaulted not for the America First agenda that they were promised, but for other people's agendas that they don't necessarily support. And they're all tied together, including these deportations, because they're all based on the same view that essentially the executive branch runs the country without any checks of any kind,
Mm.
including those in the Constitution.
Hey, that was a clip from Just Asking Questions. You can watch another one here or the full episode here. And please subscribe to our brand new channel to get us started off right and be notified when new episodes or clips go up. Thanks for watching.